All right. Greetings and salutations to everyone in the room and everyone who may or may not be watching at home. So today's topic, we're going to be going over a brief history of rope bondage, both not just Japanese but broad rope bondage. I think it's important to specify that whenever someone is talking about the history of anything, they are coming towards that history with a perspective. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about what my perspective is and what the premises associated with this are. There are really three for this particular presentation. The first one is an understanding that all rope is rope. It does not matter if you came from Japan or came from the US or came from Europe or came from Australia or came from the Middle East or came from wherever. The development historically of rope bondage has a lot more connections going back and forth than people necessarily understand broadly. Number two, there aren't a whole lot of real new ideas in art. The shit that we are doing now that is popular in rope bondage has been popular for decades or more. So we're going to see some examples of that. Three, the only real documents that we have in and about the history of rope bondage, and part of the reason that this is complete and I can't show incomplete and I can't show everything that I'd like, where these were created by people who worked in black and gray market economies. The art that you have that exists today is made on the back of sex workers, and everyone should sort of recognize that thing. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Before we get into everything, I want to make a brief disclaimer about what the content of this is going to be. I need to click onto my thing to make the disclaimer. Disclaim. What did I do now? Like with everything else. All right, cool. Brief disclaimer. BDSM and bondage have politically fraught origins that are interconnected with the oppression of peoples worldwide. To play with these ideas and not recognize those origins is to court harm to yourself and others. Inform yourself about those things. Number two, I do not consider myself an expert. I am at best an accomplished amateur. There are other people that are doing a lot more exacting and in-depth research into this type of work. You need not take pictures of this. You'll have access to all the presentations, everything when we're done. You'll also have access to all of my speaker notes. Those come with annotations of where I found this information and reference points back to all the pictures and images that you're going to see. There is a content warning. There will be frank discussions, including potentially triggering subjects like consent violation, physical abuse, psychological trauma, rape, and suicide. One of the unfortunate outcomes of a lot of these things being produced by people who were sex workers and were legally oppressed in most of the cultures that they've worked in are that the outcomes of the way that society treats folks who are in that profession are not great. I want to sort of talk about all of the people that have contributed to this art, but I want to talk about it in a realistic manner. There are people who have been really influential artists in this world who have done really terrible things, and I want to talk about the complicated nature of who those people are and sort of what has happened. You look like you have a question. You have a question? Okay, cool. Finally, I will be naming incidences that I am aware of when consent violations or other harmful behavior have happened in order to give an accurate account of history. I don't know everything about everyone and encourage anyone to add to my knowledge. So if there's something here that I don't know about, feel free to say something. Finally, this is a place for discussion. If you have questions about anything that I talk about, I am happy to answer them. Raise your hand, ask. I'll repeat the question for folks who are watching now or maybe watching in the future, and then we'll sort of talk through what I know of what the answer to that thing will be. Cool. So I've broken down the timeline into multiple eras that I sort of want to talk about and places that I've kind of demarcated as instances that I see of sort of development of rope bondage generally. And the place that we're going to start with first is what I call the pre-modern era. So this is pre-1900. While popular magazines like Cosmo or Men's Health or something like that want to indicate to you that shibari is a historical and mystical art that has existed for hundreds of years, it actually really has only existed about 100 years. at least in any of the reference materials that we can find of it as an erotic art. It is, however, the culmination of multiple influences that range back hundreds of years. So one of those influences are what I call martial and carceral depictions. What these basically mean are instances in which rope and tying someone was used for military or police action. So tied someone as a form of arresting them. This tended to be more frequent in Japan simply due to the access of metal. So rope as a way or means of arresting someone or capturing someone during a battle tended to be the default as opposed to metal because it just lacked in that society, right? So we're going to look at a couple of images. Again, I'm going to draw comparisons to the way that we do rope today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that became filtered from what it is in these pictures to what we see today. So this first image is a historical print. It is from Tsukushima Volume 1. This was somewhere around 1632. And this is sort of a depiction of a prisoner, as you can see, being led towards a jail or a prison. The figures in the upper right-hand corner, you can sort of see the arms are bound behind the back. There is a line of rope going around the chest in capturing the arms, and they are being led ahead of the person who has captured them with a rope from behind. This is going to recur so frequently, and the ubiquity of this sort of image, the eroticization of it, and the idea of it is like where we get a TK or a hands behind tie from, right? The second is from the Soga Monogatari. This is the epic tale of the Soga brothers that were two samurais. You can see in the bottom sort of right hand, you've got a character that has been brought in front of the shogun. Arms are bound behind him. Rope is across the chest. Rope leading away from that tie to the person who has arrested him. Keep in mind this particular image. We're going to return to a near exact replica of this idea at some point in the future. This is where I kind of get a little bit on my soapbox. While these are all references to what people would call Hojojitsu, which is sort of a martial art that incorporates rope, there are oftentimes people in our community now and through the years that I've been involved with it who want to draw a direct line from, oh, Hojojitsu is the beginning of what became Shibari. And I think that that's really inaccurate. What it is, and if anyone propagates that they're teaching you Hojojitsu, or they're teaching a Hojojitsu class, they have learned it from a book. It is not a contiguous martial art. Its antecedents long stopped practicing it. People rediscovered the books that were written about it and have tried to then translate those books and incorporate them into their personal approach. Hojojitsu is not meant to be safe. It is meant to injure or harm people. That is sort of the point of that as a martial art. So when people say that there's a specific connection from what we practice as erotic rope bondage today to that thing, I want to put it through what I would consider an apt comparison, which is, to me, to use the college entrance exam version of it, Shibari is to Hojojitsu as Darth Vader is to a shogun, or is to a samurai. George Lucas has explicitly expressed that the armor that he built around Darth Vader is specifically influenced by that of a samurai. But there has obviously been a broad interpolation between those two things and the passage of time and the bias of the viewer who helped to create the imagery. So if anyone sort of says one is the other, this is a thing to keep in mind. Like what has happened is people did Hojojitsu, there were artistic representations of it that people then turned into physical performances of it in plays and things like that people then saw and eroticized, that then they started to practice, right? So there are so many variations between the impression of what was happening versus the actual representation of what was happening. So those were sort of historical prints. Let's talk a little bit about fictional prints that existed in that time. So these were used in stories. The first one of these is from the legend of Minamoto no Yorimitsu, This is from 1786. If you look at this particular image in comparison to the one that I asked you to keep in your mind, this is a near exact representation of that particular depiction, except in this instance, it depicts the capture of a Shuten Doji, or a demon general. So demon general causing problems, becomes arrested, gets brought in front of the shogun, arms are bound behind him, line goes around the chest. All of those things are nearly sort of a one-to-one representation of that historical imagery that I showed you, but this is when it starts to become a bit more fictional. Another example of this is the story of Sancho Daio. This particular image is from 1890. Sancho Daio, or Sancho the Bailiff, was sort of a, police figure, maybe sort of like a, private investigator, somebody who sort of solved problems for wealthy families. In this instance, the depiction is of two wayward daughters being returned to their father. Both of them are bound with their hands behind, rope across, Sancho controlling them with the ropes. You can see the daughter on the right-hand side, if you can look close enough, has a little bit of an upturned smile at the edge of her mouth, indicating that this might not be as bad as one might think it would be. There's an interesting point to be made sort of in this particular print, and we'll sort of talk about it a little bit more as we go on, and that is there was application of rope in a domestic setting as a form of punishment. So there would be children who were disobedient, or servants who were lazy or broke things, that the punishment for doing that would be, I'm going to literally tie you up and put you in a closet. Like, this is I'm not going to spank you, I'm going to tie you up, and you go away now. So much of the way as when we are children, we can create an erotic context around being spanked, because that is the typical punishment, sort of, or at least my typical punishment in my experience of growing up as a child. There sort of could be made a similar one-to-one comparison. Finally, these are woodblock prints from Utagawa Kunisada, and the second one is an artist called Yoshitoshi from The Lives of Modern People. The first one is from 1853, the second one is from 1887. There's actually an interesting connection between these, and these were sort of some of the first color-printed periodicals that could be purchased in Japan. And there's a sort of a similarity between those and what was going on in kind of the early pictorial Western lurid press that was going on, where you had sort of yellow papers where they were telling stories of people being kidnapped or people being harmed, or they would tell exaggerated sometimes, but specifically evocative stories in order to sell more papers. This is sort of a very similar idea. One of the other things I want to note about this is the image on the right of the woman bound with her hands behind her. Her kimono is disheveled, her hair is disheveled, and there's a bit of hair running from the side of her face through her mouth. This becomes super specifically erotic to the person that we're going to discuss, who is kind of the godfather of rope bondage, a guy named Ito Seiyu. But like, this is Ito's jam. This is the thing that Ito is very much into. The final bit that I want to talk about is dramatic depictions. So these were things that weren't only happening in print imagery, but they were things that existed in stage plays. So historical stage plays were put on, and people were often bound for specific reasons, and there would be an attention paid to how that bondage happened, so the crowd could actually see it visually. So the first, this is a picture book of actors' portraits from 1861. Again, you can see two actors in this instance, woman bound, disheveled, hair in the mouth again, rope across the chest. These are repeating themes. This is a photo from 1916. In this particular one, I think the thing that is worth noting is that the rope on the person who is kneeling is dual colored. It's white and colored, so that it would be apparent against the kimono that the person was wearing, against their costume, and so the audience could see the bondage that was going on. And sort of similarly in this, a historical depiction, probably Marshall, This is actually from 1918. You can really very well see the bondage that's going across the person's chest. Any questions about any of this stuff? And also, you can ask questions later. You need not have your questions ready now. Cool. We'll move on. The next bit is what I like to call... Oh, question down in the front.
For the plays, was it like anyone? Was it seen as like alternative type of plays, or was it like sort of?
So the question was, were the plays? I want to make sure that I get this right. Are you asking if the plays were seen as mainstream or alternative?
Yeah.
Cool. The question is about whether the plays. No, these were mainstream plays that people went to broadly, and people took their kids to. And there are specific stories about folks who got into bondage who would recount being like, "Oh, I was at this play or I was at this thing, and this is the thing that sort of became stuck in my head as a child." Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. So we're going to move on to the pre-war era, or what I actually consider to sort of be the birthplace of recorded erotic bondage. And in order to do that, you sort of have to talk about the guy with the pen and the paper on the right-hand side. And that person is Ito Seiyu. Ito was born in 1882. He died in 1961. Ito was a serious artist in addition to being a pervert. He started in newspaper illustration, doing art for that before moving into theater and theater criticism. Ito was doing theater criticism in and around the time in Japan where there was a theatrical movement called Erugoru, or Erugoru Nonsensu, which is sort of a malpropism of the English erotic gore and nonsense. And it really has, like, Erugoru Nonsensu has these interesting connections of the same time to things like the French Grand Guignol, or what became German Expressionism in Weimar Germany. So the idea was that these were theatrical movements that were meant to outrage and provoke audiences by depicting specific gory, lurid, implicitly sexual acts that would draw more people in and scandalize them. So this was a thing that both Ito was reviewing and taking part in. He published his first book, his first photo book depicting rope torture, Sime no Kinkyu, or Research into Torture, in 1928. I've actually seen a copy of this book. I've held it and looked at it. It's super cool because it's not published in the same way that you would think, like, oh, I pick up a book and there are pictures in it. It's literally reprints of the photos mounted into a book, like an old photo album that people had before all the digital photos. So it's super cool because it's actual reprints of the photos. Question?
What did you say it's called? The last word is
Kenkyu, Kenkyu, Kenkyu. One of the other things that Ito Seiyu was known for was a play, or actually, he became known through a play. So a playwright named Shinzaburo Suzuki wrote a play called Burning Her Alive, dramatizing the scandalous activities of Ito's studio in Japan. So it's since been translated into English. If you want to hear a reading of that play, there's actually a recorded reading of it on the Kinbaku Namicon podcast that you can find on their website. Ito sort of had two models. The first was Kaneo Sasaki, who's pictured here. This was Ito's mistress from about 1916 to about 1918. She was a model, an actress, and participated in a whole lot of Ito's work. The other person was his wife. That was Kisei Sahara. They were married in 1919. One of probably the most, so this is a photo and then a drawing. The drawing you can see sort of mirroring the previous images that we saw. Disheveled kimono, arms bound behind, disheveled hair, hair going into the mouth. Probably one of the more famous images that Ito took of Kisei Sahara was this reenactment of The Lonely House on the Adachi Moor, which is a print by the previously mentioned Yoshitoshi. Lonely House on the Adachi Moor is an image depicting a ghost story, essentially about a pregnant woman who is lost and finds shelter with someone who turns out to be a witch. An even as interesting story is that in order to create this photo image, Ito hired some of the workmen who were working at his house to help him in suspending his then pregnant wife. How he hired them to do that was both by paying them and giving them lots of sake. So this was a depiction of drunk workmen suspending a pregnant woman. Yeah, wild. I want to talk a little bit about, so in doing the initial research for this presentation, I got through the Ito portion of things, and I was like, well, rope bondage seems to die out around 1930. I don't know. And I kind of looked at Melissa, and Melissa was like, World War II, idiot. And I was like,
why is there just this gap? And I was like, well, duh, there was a war.
so surprise, there was a war. And people tend to think less about erotic content when they are fighting for their lives.
Or the publishing industry might not be the focus of, business when there are other things going on.
Also true. The publishing industry is not the focus. In the slides going forward, I'm going to start to break apart things because they will be focused on multiple people. So we're going to start off with a conversation about people, then we're going to start off with a conversation about media, and those things are going to get broken down into smaller categories as the presentation proceeds, just because there's going to be more detail. Question?
We just focused on this one guy
Yeah.
in the pre-war era. Were there other people that are just kind of passively mentioned as engaging in rope bondage?
So the question was, were there other people other than Ito? So I think that there likely were, right? The challenge in representing these things is who had the type of capital to publish materials or publish anything about specifically such a scandalous topic. So you needed to be in a certain situation within society to where publishing something like this wouldn't do damage to your reputation, but you also needed to land in a place where you had the type of capital to produce this type of material. So while Ito was likely not unique in pursuing these things from an erotic standpoint, Ito was unique in the place of being able to create representations of those things in print and photos. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Cool. And it's hard to talk about like maybe what somebody said once from a historical standpoint. So let's start by talking about people. I'm going to talk about some non-Japanese folks, and then I'm also going to talk about some Japanese folks. The first person I would like to talk about is John Willie, aka John Alexander Scott Coots, born in 1902, died in 1962. John Willie was born to British parents in Singapore, returned to the UK in 1903. He was a photographer, an artist, and an editor. He founded Achilles Exotic Footwear, which was a company that specialized specifically in high-heeled women's shoes and extremely high-heeled women's shoes. He was the initial creator of Bazaar magazine while he was living in Canada. He most famously created the Sweet Gwendolyn series, depicting himself, as you can see on the right. That is him drawing himself as the Distic Darcy. His sort of drawings and the depictions that exist in Bazaar magazine ended up informing a lot of not just what we consider Western style bondage and Western style SM when it comes specifically to things like hoods and gags and leather restraints and bondage positions, but also specifically influenced people in Japan, and we'll sort of show those examples. He definitely influenced people like Gene Bilbrew and Eric Stanton, who were cartoonists that came after him. His second wife and frequent model for both photos and drawings was Holly Anna Faram. One of Irving Klaw's buddies is the guy that's sitting in the middle in the photo. You probably recognize the person on the right, but the person in the middle is a guy named Irving Klaw. Irving Klaw was born in 1910. He passed away in 1966. He was sort of the self-styled pinup king. He was a photographer and a filmmaker. He began selling bondage-based photos and films out of the back of Movie Star News with his sister Paula. Movie Star News was a shop that sold movie star headshots in New York. So back then, if you were a fan of insert whatever movie star you liked, there were these stores that would just have photos in the same way that record stores used to have albums or CDs or tapes. And you would scroll through and find, oh, I'm a fan of Humphrey Bogart. Here's my Humphrey Bogart headshot. I'm going to take it and frame it and put it up on my wall or next to my bedstand or wherever that might be. In addition to those sales, Irving Klaw had a little something behind the counter for particular people who were interested and sort of shared those interests. He started the careers of models like Betty Page, June King, Joan Rydell, Jackie Miller, a whole bunch of folks that became sort of the baseline for what Americans and Europeans saw as bondage. So this person is Toshiyuki Suma, aka Minamoro Ku, aka Kitareku, aka so many other pseudonyms. He was born in 1920. He passed away in 1992. He had over 100 plus synonyms for his work as an artist, a photographer, and an editor. The way that Minamoro Ku sort of tells the story of his fascination with bondage specifically is that he reputedly found his grandfather's stash of old Seme e-books while he was being punished by his mother. So I sort of mentioned like, oh, if you did something bad, they would tie you up and throw you in a closet. Well, Minamoro Ku's mother put him in a closet because he was being bad. What she didn't realize is that closet at his grandparents' house contained his grandpa's old porno mags. And that's how Minamoro Ku, and this might be apocryphal, but I think it's a great story. He was one of the first editors of Kitan Club magazine. So if Bizarre magazine was sort of like the English language Western definition for what bondage is, Kitan Club was its analog, but in Japan. He consulted in countless magazines, including, we'll talk about the Japanese publishing boom, Uramoto, SM Collector, Abu Hunter, SM Kitan, a whole bunch of different magazines. I presume everyone knows who this person is. I would hope.
Who is it?
This is Betty Page. Betty Page was born in 1923, passed away in 2008. Betty Page is the queen of pinups, is probably the baseline, one of the earliest stars of rope bondage. She was a New York actress and pinup model who began working with Irving Klaw and John Willie. There are multiple biographies on her, there are documentaries, and there's a full feature film. So if you have an interest in Betty Page, there is plenty of documentation about her career. This is a person I want to spend more time talking about. This is Rumi Kasuga. Rumi Kasuga was born in 1931. Rumi Kasuga, in some ways, the person standing, is the Betty Page of Japan. Queer woman, tied men and women, was tied by men and women, worked for Kitan Club magazine beginning in the 1950s, was active through that entire time in Japanese publishing of magazines up until the 1970s. Was sort of in the same way that Betty Page kind of became this iconic image of the damsel in distress. Rumi Kasuga was sort of the first prototype to what all both sort of female sadists and female bondage models were. The last person I want to talk about is Takeishi Sugimura. Sugimura was born in 1921, passed away in 1987. He was a writer, an artist, and a photographer. He was the person that tied the rope for nearly the entire run of Kitan Club magazine. He is likely the person who is most responsible for connecting the work of Ito Seiyu to what we now consider modern bondage. He did serious research into Hojo Jitsu, not as a method of replicating those ties, but as a method of understanding them so he could create safety in the ties of the model, in the ties that he was doing on the models that he had. Any questions about any of those figures? Question?
Is there a sense that the US scene and the Japan scene were in dialogue with each other?
So the question was whether or not the Western scene and the Japanese scene were in dialogue with each other. As we go along this, I'm going to show you physical imagery that shows that they were very much in dialogue with each other. And I think one of the misnomers that a lot of people have were that these things developed separately and they weren't talking to each other and there wasn't an understanding of the two things. And I think part of that comes from the ability to look at, the ability to look at bondage from one place or another as a separate and different thing adds to its marketability for its uniqueness when those things really did flow back and forth pretty regularly. Another question.
Comment.
Comment.
It is easy to think about this as things that are happening in like the far past. This is all post-war Japan.
Yeah.
So relatively rapid travel is possible. Relatively rapid shipment of materials is possible. I think it is interesting that we think about these as history that has happened, not as a thing that is very, very recent to us relative to sort of the scale of human timelines.
And generally, this is coming right off of the heels when there were a ton of American servicemen in and around Japan, right? And there was a ton of interaction and understanding, albeit in a lot of ways problematic, of Japanese culture and of American culture, and of those two things having a specific interest in each other, even in the most unhealthy ways, right? So I want to talk about the two big, and I've sort of touched on these things, the media of the time. So these are some images from Bazaar Magazine. Bazaar Magazine ran for 26 issues from 1945 to 1959. We're going to talk a little bit about why that run was so short. It featured the work of John Willie, Betty Page, Irving Klaw, all of those folks. Probably one of the more interesting folks that came out of this as a cartoonist was Adolfo Marina Ruiz, Hispanic gentleman who became cartoonist that did a lot of the depictions of rope bondage and other things. This is an example of Kitan Club Magazine. Kitan Club Magazine ran for 325 issues from 1947 to 1975. It's where Ito Seiyu meets Minomoto Ku. It's where Ito Seiyu meets Takahashi Sujimura, and we'll sort of talk about how that becomes somebody like Akira Naka today. We are going to move into what I call the media explosion era of 1955 to 1975. In the sense of explosion, I mean it in two ways. I mean it in one place, getting hugely large, and in another place, exploding and disappearing. So in this instance, I'm going to break the people into people in Japan and people not in Japan. For the people in Japan, there are a couple of people I'd like to talk about. But before we get into it, when I sort of talk about those arguing explosions, what I mean is that in 1957, in the United States, there was this thing called the Kefauver hearings that was conducted by Estes Kefauver. The attempt was to link pornography and lurid materials like comic books to juvenile delinquency across the United States. This was a time when like Betty Page and Irving Klaw and all of those people were called before Congress to testify about bondage and its depictions and whether or not it was pornographic. What this led to was a driving of all of that kind of publishing underground, much, much, much less depictions of that. In the same time in Japan, so while this is all going away in the US, there was an explosion of available media that went from about 30 publications or periodicals around rope bondage in the 50s to over 130 in the 70s. So like the number of, like while ours were shrinking and going away, in Japan, they were just adding more and more and more and more and more content, right? So folks that are working in Japan, I want to talk about a few people. The person on the left is Nobuyushi Araki. Araki was born in 1940. Nobuyushi Araki is like worldwide, probably the most singularly known photographer that has ever captured bondage imagery. Araki is known sort of first and foremost as a fine art photographer, and sort of secondly as somebody who is interested in rope bondage generally. By 2005, he had published over 350 books, including Sentimental Journey, which was a depiction of the life and death of his wife. Tokyo Lucky Hole, which was a documentation of Japan's sex industry, sort of from the inside out. He's had museum collections shown in the Tate, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, sort of all over the world. He is a world-renowned photographer. There are so many Taschen books that have Iraqi imagery in them. Ordinals has several of them if you want to look at them.
I have one.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a documentary called Iraqamentary that you can watch. One thing I want to note about Iraqi has had frequent disputes with models over payment and the nature of his relationships with them being abusive. So it's something to keep in mind when you keep in mind the idea of that person. The second person I want to talk about is Yukihiko Kuroiwa, aka Oniroku Dan. Oniroku Dan was born in 1931 and lived until 2011. He is singularly the most celebrated writer of SM novels in Japan. He was published in Kitan Club, Fuzoku Club, Uramado, Abu Hunter, all over the place. The single thing that he is most known for contributing to Japanese culture and rope bondage culture in specific is the idea of this story called Flower and Snake, or Hane to Hebe. The general form, and the thing about Flower and Snake is it has taken so many forms since he originally published the story. So it was a story series. It's been multiple films. I think it's 7 or 9 films. It's been a manga, and possibly my most favorite, it was turned into a stage musical. The general idea of Hanato Hebe is married man, in debt, has a wife who is depicted sort of as like a little bit sexually inhibited. As part of the way to pay off his debt, his wife goes into service for insert whoever he owes money to. In some of the tellings, it's business people, and others, it's criminals, in whoever. But by entering that world, it unlocks this insatiable sexual energy within her that has to do with bondage and all sorts of what would be considered deviant sexuality. But it has been like, there are so many different depictions of this thing. I have multiple movie versions of it. If you're curious about it, like, I can point you to a whole bunch of different places where you can find different representations. What? The show? It's called Flower and Snake, generally. Flower and Snake. Yeah. Later in his life, Oniroku Dan wrote for many of what were called the Nikatsu Roman porno films, which were sort of softcore rope bondage porno films. One of the stories that he wrote that became a film is where the name Devil Mask Society comes from. It was about a group of perverts who would take women out into the Bay of Tokyo on a large ship and do deviant sexual things with them. And their group was called the Devil Mask Society, which is where we stole the name from. What's that? Yeah, it's our origin story. The next person I want to talk about is Sujiro Norio. Sujiro was born in 1942, is still alive. Sujiro began doing photography for SM magazines in the early 70s. He's had, now 50 plus years of bondage photography for innumerable publications. He's influenced the work of folks like Takaishi Nagaike, Akira Nawa, Wicked Dave, so many modern rope artists. So a lot of the ways that you see the dark background, high contrast, very lit photos that people like Naka do, like all of that is influenced by Sujiro. So people in the US that sort of do it, like Rigor Otis sort of has a really similar style to this. People like Ricardo Wildties, anyone who's sort of really heavily influenced by Akira Naka probably has some influence from Sujiro Norio. Naka has come to the United States and they've like taught together. So very, very sort of influential.
Also, Wicked Dave and Clover.
Yeah, Wicked Dave and Clover's photo style, which you can see on the wall to the right, the far right of this wall is one of their photo prints, is very influenced by Sujiro Norio.
Yeah, like that super bright, contrasty photo style is that being influenced by him.
The next person I want to talk about is Yukihiko Kuria. Oh no, I've talked about Oniroku Dan. This is Osada Ikichi, excuse me. Osada Ikichi was born in 1925, passed away in 2001. Osada Ikichi is essentially the father of live rope bondage performance. He is the namesake that Osada Steve's name comes from, if you're familiar with Osada Steve. He performed consistently for 35 years and was, I think was loosely known as the rope demon. because of the speed with which he would do things on stage. So he would be tying 2 or 3 models and would tie one and would run to another one and whip them and then come back and suspend this one and then come back and put them on a thing and spin them around and come back to another one. There are very few I've seen one video representation of one of his performances, and it is the guy is insane. He is running around like I cannot believe. His name's Osada Ikichi, Eikichi. A thing to note about Osada Ikichi, and a thing that continues to remain popular to this day in rope bondage, one of the things that Osada Ikichi was also known as was as the flying Nawashi. And what he would do would suspend someone, jump on their back as though they were a surfboard, and swing them out over the first rows of the audience. Here's the thing about that. If you do that with models for enough time and you put their bodies under enough strain, it causes things like degenerative bone disease and really bad spinal problems. And these were things that his models suffered later in life and are things to keep in mind if you are a fan of, I'm going to suspend someone and then put my body weight on them, right? That's not great for bodies. Suspension.
There are ways to do it that don't actually put weight onto the person, but cheat and look as though they are doing that. If you are curious about those things, please talk to us.
Yeah.
Please do not just put all of your weight on a person who is suspended in the room.
Human bodies are not meant to be suspended in this way generally, and there will always be unpleasantness and discomfort and, in some instances, injury that comes from that. Don't make it worse. The final person I want to talk about on the Japanese side is Arado Hiroshi. Arado Hiroshi was born in 1933. He was an apprentice editor of Uramoto magazine. He went on to do all of the tying in the previously referenced Nikatsu Roman porno films. So a lot of what Arado Hiroshi is known for is adjustment to ties that make them more safe to be sustainable over longer amounts of time. He was quite often tying models who didn't have context on bondage, who would have to do multiple takes where they were bound, and he would have to engineer things that looked representative of intense bondage, but were ostensibly safe and safe for long periods of time. I want to move on to folks that were working worldwide at this time. The first person I want to talk about is this gentleman, Tuukko Laaksonen. I'm terrible at his actual name. Also known as Tom of Finland. Everybody should-ish know who Tom of Finland is. He became, yeah. He began creating illustrations for what were then called beefcake magazines. So in the West, there was this long, actually both in Japan and in the West, there's this long history of depiction of like men's physical fitness and health and nudity or semi-nudity as not something that's pornographic, but that is meant to be like respected in the same way that you would respect the statue of David. The physique of a man is a piece of art within itself. In a lot of instances, this was thinly veiled homosexual content. In the 70s, he started publishing explicit homosexual comics, as is seen by this image on the right. His homoerotic depictions of motorcycle culture, police culture, military cultures, in a lot of ways still define what gay leather is and the archetypes that we think of when we sort of think of gay leather culture. This is not a picture of this person, but this is a picture of this person's work. I couldn't actually find a picture of this person, but I want to talk a little bit about Barbara Baer. Barbara Baer was an editor and photographer who was responsible for sort of the rebirth of American bondage publishing with a publishing group called House of Milan. We'll talk a little bit about the different magazines that House of Milan published and how they're like the names even of those magazines are used today for website content. But she was sort of the person who there's very little known about her. I've tried to find a whole bunch and have had a really hard time doing it. Mostly, but it's really interesting that like this woman was sort of the rebirth in a post-Kefauver hearing world of published bondage material in the United States. The final person I want to talk about is Eric Stanton. Eric Stanton published a whole bunch of underground comics in and around this area. A lot of things that were reprints of Bazaar magazine, including Bazaar Comics. On the right-hand side, that was republished in the mid-'70s. It included work by both him, John Willie, the previously mentioned Adolfo Ruiz. Probably one of my favorite things about Eric Stanton, if you look at the influence of his art style on the left-hand side. Eric Stanton was a roommate of a guy named Steve Ditko. Does anybody know who Steve Ditko is? Guess? Steve Ditko is the guy who created Spider-Man. Steve Ditko is also the guy who created Doctor Strange. If you keep that era of comics in mind when you look at the comic on the left-hand side, there is an interesting crossover there, man. Let's talk a little bit about the media, both in Japan and worldwide. In Japan, there is the publishing of, so this is Uramoto magazine, or Back Window magazine. It was published from 1956 to 1965. This becomes a place where Minomoto Ku, the guy who knew Ito Seiyu, meets a guy named Nareki Chimuo. Nareki Chimuo becomes the person who teaches Akira Naka, and that's how you get a direct line from somebody who is practicing rope bondage today to the person who first started recording rope bondage over 100 years ago. While in Uramoto we primarily see solo model depictions, a good portion of Uramoto magazine, and this doesn't get publicized, I guess, or seen a whole bunch, are depictions of women tying men. It influenced a lot of the Western art by people like Eric Stanton and Adolfo Ruiz, excuse me. One of the things I wanted to call out were sort of two specific images from Uramoto magazine that are generally popular right now. So the one on the left, sort of the kneeling punishment board, which you can buy at myriad places right now, are really well available and are pretty popular. In this instance, the model is being pressed by stones down into that board, which looks intense to me. On the right-hand side is a depiction of what we would most likely call a hashira tie, so a single tied point from a pole that is part of the architecture of that particular building.
What year are these?
Those are like 50s to 70s. I don't have the exact number on those particular photos, but Uramoto magazine ran from 56 to 65. So these are the pictures. So this is Uramoto magazine, and on the left you have a drawing by Eric Stanton, and on the right you have a drawing by Adolfo Ruiz. So back to the question that you asked previously about influences going back and forth. So even this far back and this early out of the Second World War, when publishing started to pick up, they were reprinting things that had been created in the US, right? Let's talk about other things that were going on broadly, not in Japan. So first, I sort of referenced House of Milan. You can see on either of these images, these are both Hogtie magazine. Hogtie has since become an iconic brand under the kink umbrella, but there were a lot of like titles that started in House of Milan that just kind of got carried over to other places. It's interesting to me specifically the images on the left. The person at the far left in sort of the vertical image, her arms are bound behind her in what is a typical strappado, but would be a strappado that would be something that you would be comfortable seeing either in Hogtie magazine or in Uramoto or in Kitan Club, like any of those things. And then the image in the circle on the right-hand side has a woman with her arms tied behind her head in what is very close to what we would call a pillow tie. And that is something that is usually very much associated with Japanese bondage, right? The other person I sort of want to talk about a little bit is Robert Bishop. Robert Bishop was an artist who primarily worked with House of Milan. His drawings were influenced by people like John Willie Stanton and Ruiz. He is very much from an art standpoint, I think kind of representative of what became known as Western bondage, or sort of American bondage or damsel in distress bondage. So you can see the repeated imagery of like multiple wraps So 5, 6, 7 wraps around the legs and the arms. Really sort of like smaller rope, but a whole lot of layers of that rope. If anyone's curious about any of Bishop's stuff, House of Milan actually published this really cool playing card deck with all of the drawings of the non-face cards. The face cards were all photos of House of Milan models, but the non-face cards are all different drawings by Robert Bishop. I have that deck of cards in my office, like in a display thing, if you want to take a look at it. I totally dig his artwork style. I'm a big fan of his. The last I wanted to talk about was Harmony Concepts, which was a publisher at this time. They published things like Bondage Life and Bondage Parade. Part of the reason that I wanted to include these is if you look at the image on the left-hand side of exclusives, there includes acro bondage. And on the right-hand side of exclusives, there includes bondage yoga. So this goes under the category of there ain't shit that we've come up with that people weren't doing 50 plus years ago. Let's talk about the era that, any questions about any of those things?
When you say Western bondage is like damsel in distress, it seemed like some of the earlier Japanese bondage was sort of similar in terms of like the musk hair, the women who were like captured. So what would you say, besides like smaller wraps, are there other like differences that you would define?
So the question was about the difference between what people perceive as Western bondage and Japanese bondage, and sort of similarities about like musked hair and disheveled people, as well as a question about like how would I define those differences. So I think those differences in a lot of ways are arbitrary. I think that they were distinctions made, as I said, sort of before, like in a weird marketing thing, like the other thing is different and therefore valuable. Generally, what I would say people would ascribe to as Western bondage would be things that you would see that like John Willie drew in Sweet Gwendolyn, or images that are similar to the ones that are depicted by Robert Bishop. They tend to be like an over-the-mouth, over-the-nose gag look that is kind of similar to like what would be like a Wild West bank robber. The bondage itself tends to be a lot of wraps and then cinches in between. And so what you'll get is like a lot of wraps around the forearms and then a cinch to hold that together. A lot of wraps around the shin area and then cinches to hold that together. The patterns tend to be a little bit more functional and less specifically decorative. But that said, like, this is me putting myself in the place of someone who would say that those two things were different, when my argument is that those two things are very much the same.
I would also point you back to the depictions that we saw at the very beginning of like, oh, the hands behind and the wrap around the chest. I don't know if you saw, but in the like John Willie drawings and those of the other artists that Andrew has mentioned, we didn't see that shape, right? It was much more the sort of a lot of wraps and cinches that he was just talking about, as opposed to like that sort of hands behind and wrap around the chest.
The biggest, yeah, to Melissa's point, the biggest difference is box tie or no box tie. Like Western bondage doesn't have a whole lot of box ties. Doesn't have a whole lot of box, like squared arms in the back.
Well, and an additional thing to that, going back to how the through line from Hojo Jitsu comes into what we know as Kinbaku and Shibari, is that within the sort of the practice of Hojo Jitsu, there were particular patterns that were used to depict who is this person in bondage, to depict like sort of their rank, their place in society was all encapsulated in what pattern they were being tied in as they were being paraded through town, because that was a way to shame them, was to make sure everyone knew, like, you are of this rank, you have done this thing, like this type of tie is only reserved for that type of person. So there are a lot more patterns associated with that get sort of translated into some of the patterns that we see now. But again, through a artistically interpreted and then eroticized way. And that history isn't as present in folks like John Willie. Like they don't have that so they don't necessarily have those kinds of patterns to pull from.
Yeah, I think it is very much a like ask three people, get three different answers. For me, especially in a modern context, thinking about like what you might see now in terms of content that people are producing, it is not about the way that the rope is placed on the body. It is about the accessory kinks that are frequently present. So I think of quote unquote Western bondage as high heels, as giant ball gags, and as stockings.
And there's nothing wrong with any of those things.
No,
I
no,
like
no,
all of those
yeah.
things.
Yeah.
Corsets, yeah, a lot of like very, very restrictive, and very put together.
All of these are yes, please to me.
Yeah.
And a lot of it for more Japanese style that I have seen is that like disheveled. So it's like the opposite. Like one is very put together and the other is very pulled apart. If that makes sense.
So I've got one question, two questions. So
So it's not a question, but it's interesting to hear the definition of like Western style bondage from a historical context because since I moved, I've been hearing a lot of people say that they consider Western style bondage like what Shay does, and like colorful, bright, shiny robe and like acrobatic and sort of like flying through the air. And I took it by surprise.
and so it's like anything else, the definitions of those things have changed over time, right? You had a question.
Can you just spell the photographers who did the like high contrast, like Noria, I think?
Oh, Sugiura, S. Ooh. Let me scroll up.
Y'all will also get access.
Yeah,
to
you're gonna
of
get
the
access to all
notes
this
and
stuff.
The presentation.
Yeah, you will have access to all of these things, and there'll be links to things and stuff and everything
Yeah.
else.
Okay, great.
I am the type of nerd who documents all of this shit and who wants to show where his sources came from. And even though a lot of what I'm expressing is opinion, I want you to understand where that opinion is informed from. Because people spouting off shit about history without any attribution are assholes.
We have a lot of opinions about citation as a political act in this household.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So any other questions before we move on to the swinging 70s? One last one.
I guess all this conversation kind of leads me to a point where it's like, is it even like, this is a hybrid question comment that I'm curious if your thoughts on is like why even like call what we're doing Shibari? Like,
Hybrid question of why call what we are doing Shibari? So I think that there's
You needn't. First of all.
yeah, you can call something whatever you want to call it.
sure.
I think that there are questions that each individual person needs to tease out around the ideas of culture, appropriation, attribution, understanding where things come from as a function of what you are doing. Sort of part of the reason that I point back to like there aren't any new ideas is that to me, when I see a new idea, when I see something that is something that I have not encountered in the amount of research that I've done, it makes that thing that much more valuable as an idea. So I don't know that there's a whole lot of value. The amount of value that comes into the words that you call, or that is created by the words that you call someone, is entirely imbued by you. So if Shibari isn't worth, like if the value of the history of it isn't worth using that word, then use the word that best describes the thing that you are doing. Because the thing that you're doing is inherently unique to who you are. Two questions.
So I just had a comment. So my thinking about why I use the word shibari is because it creates a sense of community. It creates this connection between the people that are doing something similar. And while everyone does have a unique point of view and everyone comes to it from different perspectives, it allows us all to gather under this umbrella and to have this common goal or this common word that I can't find that's floating around in my head. But it allows us to connect with each other. So it's creating a common language, common parlance.
Sort of similar. I don't know. Someone literally just asked me this yesterday because I was talking about what I do and I mentioned it. You say like rope bondage, and they were like, "Oh, so you must not do like shibari, otherwise you would have said that." And I was like, "No, I'm like learning shibari, but also like I'm from bondage because I feel like it's more, but it's, I don't know, to me it's like sort of interchangeable.
I'm gonna make a super political statement, which is capitalism is the reason that we say shibari. I can sell shibari in a way that I can't sell Western bondage. I can sell shibari in a way that I can't sell rope bondage. I can sell it because there's a whole lot of racism and mysticism and strange otherness that goes into using a non-English word with an English audience. And to me, that's a thing that can draw people together and give people a sense of community. It's a thing that can cause a whole lot of arguments about what a TK really means, and does the TK, is it a takata kote or is it a gote, and do the hands need to be high, and what do those things mean? It can easily draw people together, as easily draw people together as it can pull them apart, but the one thing is it's really great at, is it's really great at selling shit. And the reason someone would ask you, why, oh, you do rope bondage, so you don't do shibari, is because there's a distinction in the market of those two things.
And I would offer an alternate that you might consider, which is the phrasing I've been taking, which is I do Japanese-inspired rope bondage, which can encompass a lot more things and doesn't use a necessarily othering term that people might not be familiar with, right? Like, and I say Japanese-inspired because most of the people I've learned from and have been influenced by are Japanese, and to me that's where the origination point of the style that I tie in tends to come from. But the people I've learned, the other people I've learned from, have also learned from some of those people, as we've seen, and those are who we're inspired by. So it's Japanese-inspired, but I'm not Japanese, and so I don't actually do shibari. But also the term shibari just means to tie, right? And I would actually say if I'm tying, it's probably kinbaku, which is a whole other complicated thing.
Listen.
Which is the erotic version of tying. So like, words are words and
All semantic arguments aside, because we can keep going on this for a very long time, and I've only got 50 more minutes for this class, let's move on to the 70s.
Sorry, this is an easy one. A fact.
Easy question.
Just because we started talking about
Yeah.
the word, when did that word come up? When did shibari come into use in Japan?
So the idea of shibari,
like anything.
anything. So there is a long, so you have to think of it as if you would say to tie your shoes, to tie a bow, to tie anything that you might tie. So it's existed as part of the language as long as someone has bound something to someone else or something to something else. So it is an arbitrary just to tie.
Like as long as there has been the word for rope, there has been the word to tie, right? Like it's just part of the language. It does not mean this art form.
Okay, so when they started becoming bondage magazines here, they were called shibari magazines there. That's okay. Totally.
All right.
It makes no sense to say I do shibari then.
Yes.
Correct.
You totally.
Correct.
Everyone here does shibari. All right. So the 70s to the 90s is a period that I'm calling the Grand Masters. These are folks that I think are most influential to the way that people tie today. We're going to start off with people in Japan, and we're going to talk about people doing tying. We're going to talk about models, and then we're going to talk about artistic depictions. So let's start off with folks who are tying, and the first person I want to talk about is Nareki Chimuo. Nareki was born in 1930 and lived until 2013. He is sort of the central figure in Japanese rope bondage from 1950 to his death in 2013, and is one of the people that carries on that direct line from Ito Seiyu through Minamura-ku to Nareki. When I say that direct line, I want to make a specific qualification. Very often, people will say, well, this person learned from this person, and this person learned from this person, and this person learned from this person, and that is that lineage. When I talk about there's a direct line from Ito Seiyu to Nareki, I mean that these dudes work together. There was not a formal, necessarily, teacher and student relationship or association. Again, it's really great to say that I am a certified Naka style and teacher, or I am a certified Osada Ryu teacher, or I am a certified Akechi Kana teacher, because those are all things that can be marketed and sold. The actual lineage of these things are, these guys all worked on magazines together. They were colleagues of each other. They watch each other work, they cribbed notes and took ideas from the people that they were working with, and that sort of carried those ideas forward, right? The idea that there was like a direct teacher-student is really loose, for lack of a better term. Nareki was a rope artist, a writer, a painter, an editor, and an educator. He wrote over 30 novels and over 1,000 essays on rope bondage. He reputedly tied somewhere in the neighborhood of 5,000 models in the time that he was tying, over 4,500, somewhere around 5,000. He founded the Kinbaken Society, which was a salon where he would tie and talk about his philosophy of rope bondage. This is where he first met people like Akira Naka and Yukimura Haruki, who then became his students, who then now teach now and have influenced people now. The next person I'd like to talk about is Akechi Denki. I will throw in my personal 2 cents. Akechi Denki is my fucking jam. Akechi Denki is my boy. I love Akechi Denki's rope bondage. He is my favorite dude. Ordinals very lovingly purchased me like my favorite art book from my favorite rope bondage person, signed by the photographer who took all of the photos. It is rad. Akechi Denki was born in 1940. He passed away in 2005. He's a self-taught bondage performer and artist whose personal style can be seen in the works of people like Akechi Kana, Osada Steve, Hajime Kinoko, Kazami Ranki, a whole lot of people. So in a lot of ways, we owe the idea of like a T-shaped gote to Akechi Denki. That is very Akechi Denki style. He began collecting SM magazines and doing self-tying when he was a teenager. He started the special member meeting at Studio Phantom in 1987 and continued to perform bondage and SM shows until 2005. The interesting thing about Akechi was Akechi had a congenital heart defect. The story that I have heard is that his family is a fairly wealthy family in construction in Japan. And he was sort of meant to take over the family business. And he nearly died from his congenital heart defect and basically decided, fuck this, I want to do rope bondage and be a deviant for the rest of my life because my life is short. And that's sort of how he became Akechi Denki. He toured the Netherlands in 1998. He was one of the first Japanese artists to leave Japan and tour the West. He was actually scheduled to teach in the United States at Thunder in the Mountains when he passed away. The year he passed away, he was scheduled to come to the US and teach. The next person I want to talk about is Yukimura Haruki. Yukimura is a rope artist, photographer, producer, and director who directly influenced the work of Osada Steve, Barkus, Wicked Dave, a whole bunch of people. Also someone who learned from Nareki Chimuo. He was originally involved as a director for photo shoots and videos. He began to develop his own ties based on his personal concepts of beauty and suffering. He taught in Copenhagen and Los Angeles in 2012 and Australia in 2014 before he passed away. He certified instructors in Japan, the United States, Europe, and Australia to teach Yukimura's style of Kinbaku. The final person that I want to talk about in Japan who is doing tying is Arasue Go. Arasue Go is a rope artist for multiple publications, videos, broadcasts, and probably my favorite, television in Japan. We'll talk about this in a second. He started performing live while he was still in college, began tying in the 70s for magazines like SM Select and SM Fans. He toured Europe in 2010, and during that tour published the first English language instructional called Mind and Technique that was meant to be a companion to the workshops that he taught. So he was sort of the first Japanese rope artist who published instruction in English. The weird thing, and I have those books if you're interested and you want to borrow them, the weird thing is the books are literally written kind of for people who were taking the class that he was in. They aren't written to be generally read. But like when I joined the rope bondage world, they were like a big important thing to have because this was a Japanese person writing in English about how to tie rope, even though they were incomplete and you had to fill in a whole lot of blanks.
And it does explain some stuff. It's
Yeah.
just very much like, there's a lot of context.
Guess these 3 steps in the middle. My favorite bit, and if you're curious about this, I also have this on DVD. He tied the bondage for the Japanese television police drama Tokubu, which is a comedy police drama. So think a comedy version of Law and Order, where all of the crimes get resolved by somebody being tied up and confessing what a minorly bad person they are. It is amazing and hilarious. You can find it on Amazon if you want. You can get the complete series on DVD on Amazon, and it's hilarious and amazing. Think of like The Office plus Law and Order Special Victims Unit plus rope bondage. That's basically what it is. So we talked about the people who were doing tying. I wanted to talk about the people who were in the ropes as well. The first I want to talk about is Naomi Taney, who was born in 1948. So Naomi Taney is sort of the bondage queen of those Nikatsu Roman porno films, or what were also called pink movies in Japan. So softcore erotic films that featured nudity and bondage. She starred in over 100 films from 1967 to 1979. She most prominently starred in Wife to be Sacrificed and the original film version of Oniroku Dan's Flower and Snake. The second person I want to talk about, and maybe my favorite of the two, is Hiromi Satomi. Began performing in live bondage shows. So while Naomi Taney was somebody who was an actress who came to bondage, Hiromi Satomi was somebody who was a bondage artist or bondage performer who came to acting. She began performing in live bondage shows in 1980. She frequently modeled for the performances of Asada Kichi, and she starred in my favorite of her roles in a movie called SM Hunter. If you have not seen SM Hunter, that movie bangs, y'all. It is so wild and so good. Yeah, it's goofy and hilarious, and yeah, it's.
She's a badass in it.
And she's a.
She like leads a girl gang of
Yeah, she leads a sexy girl gang, and like her outfits are so on point. Like, it's amazing. Question.
I guess I just mainly wanted to comment that that black and white photo on the previous slide reminds me a lot of like the Western rope bondage.
Yep.
photos
Yep.
in particular.
Hey, look, it's a big ball gag. Everybody likes a big ball gag.
Legs all the way together, all the way up.
Yeah, it has like almost like very bound.
So let's talk about some graphic artists in Japan in what was known as the modern Shunga era. The first person I want to talk about is Kasuga Akira, who was born in 1926, died in 2011. He was an artist for Uramoto magazine, SM Select, SM Fan, SM Club, SM Kitan, SM Spider, who was known for his watercolor style of rope bondage art. I find this stuff like really, really beautiful and well done. But you're seeing even through the 70s, like that same disheveled look, that same rope around the chest, that same hair in the mouth, all of those influences have continued to carry forward. The next person I want to talk about is Tsuyushi Yoshida, aka Go Mishima. Go Mishima was born in 1924, passed away in 1988. Much like Tom of Finland, he began drawing artistic male nudes, specifically of his male partner, Yukio Mishima. He eventually took Yukio Mishima's name while they could not be married like legally in Japan because of cultural outlooks on homosexuality. Go Mishima took his partner's name as his pseudonym.
Is this the same Yukio Mishima, the writer?
No, this is Go Mishima, not Yukio Mishima. Oh no, Yukio Mishima, yes, the writer, yes. You're
That
right.
was his partner.
I believe so. Yeah, wild Yukio Mishima hot takes if you want those. He moved on to doing graphic depictions of graphic bondage, masochism, torture scenes, a whole lot of things after Yukio Mishima committed ritual suicide. So after that, things got kind of dark. Very influenced by Tom of Finland, published things in Fuzoku Kitan and Bara magazines. These were the first sort of two explicitly gay Japanese publications.
Gay men.
Yeah, gay men. Excuse me. I'll very clear. Thank you. The other person is Sadao Hasegawa, born in 1945, died in 1999. Again, artist published prominently in Japanese gay male magazines, including Sabu, Samson, and Adon. Again, influenced by Tom of Finland, very influenced by Go Mishima. Unfortunately, sort of similar to Yukio Mishima, took his own life while living in Thailand because his lifestyle wasn't accepted in Japan in 1999. But really dig sort of his graphic sort of style of bondage. I believe that Ordinals has taken out some examples of both Iraqi and inspired art that you can see when we're done here. The final, and another one of my favorites, Kaname Azuma, born in 1939, passed away in 2011, was instructed in painting by his uncle Sakeo Sakai, famous for sort of painting these depictions of bondage and specifically tattooing. I don't have two here, but he's like one of the more, like he does really elaborate bondage with really elaborate tattoos on the models that are bound that are just really beautiful. A lot of his stuff has been adapted to tattoos. He created art for SM Select, SM Fan, SM King, SM Secret Novel, SM Club, and SM Kitan. The image on the right, and probably one of the things that I really most dig about Azuma, Azuma was obsessed with large body curvy folks. But didn't believe that making depictions of that size of model would be marketable in Japan. But very late in life, Azuma exhibited and published what he called his secret art book, which focused on specifically depictions of those models. And I think the stuff that he does is like really, really beautiful and pretty. So I wanted to include an image from that particular book. Statement from Ordinals.
Statement from Ordinals. This is the point at which I want to talk very briefly about the degree to which primary sources are subject to the forces of particularly capitalism in terms of what gets saved. So you will notice as we move through this presentation, there are more depictions of men or folks that we might assume to be men in bondage. There are more pictures of folks with larger bodies. There are more depictions of queer desire. It's not that those things are new or didn't exist as practices. It's that though if there were depictions of those things, they have not made it to us. We as queer, larger bodied folks who are doing radical sexuality have always been here. Those depictions haven't survived, but that doesn't mean that we weren't here and doing this thing from the beginning.
Or they weren't captured in that way, like they weren't depicted in a way that could be transmitted safely. Right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of these images might have been created, but could not be shared for fear of reprisal or, as indicated, like people feeling as though they needed to take their own
Or the cultural repression of the age that people lived in the place that people lived was such that the people who wanted to create those depictions didn't have the capital to create them, didn't have the access to places where they could be published, didn't have the ability to have the materials to make those things happen. And that's the reason that a lot of this type of imagery didn't exist, but slowly becomes more prevalent as we move forward in time. Question?
I would just like to support that notion that I think any discussion around history needs to involve like a deep questioning of like what is getting preserved and why.
And that's part of the
Who is doing it.
and that's part of the reason that I called out at the beginning that like, cool, these are sex workers and this is sparse, and the nature of history and the documentation that we have, while as much as I attempt to adhere to primary sources and people that were creating that, that's bounded by the restrictions of who has access to all of those things. And I will tell you that this presentation is specifically skewed towards me trying to seek out as many references to those things as I can possibly find in order to show as much as possible that these things existed, even in the scant instances where people had the ability to put them in a place where people could find them, right?
Totally.
Yeah, cool. Let's move on to some of the media. I made reference to this a few different times, but let's talk a little bit about the Nikkatsu Roman porno films. So Nikkatsu was one of the 2 film studios in Japan to survive World War II. But in a post-World War II world, they started to have to compete with television broadly. And one of the ways they decided to compete was by starting to make what were called the pink movies or the Roman porno movies in the 70s. These were like, cool, we're going to do more racy, adult, explicitly sexual, or at least softcore pornographic depictions of sexuality and deviant sexuality. On the left is the cover to Wife to be Sacrificed that was made in 1974. Wife to be Sacrificed, which you can still get access to, is a wild film, my friends. I have seen it. I think I have a digital copy of it if you're curious. The second is the first.
Just a quick note on Wife to be Sacrificed, if you are curious about watching it, is that there is a lot of enema play, so if that's not your jam, maybe don't.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, and it is a troubling storyline. Like the storyline starts off with a guy who has been imprisoned for being a pedophile, being released and kidnapping his wife. Like
there's a lot that happens in that.
there's
Like,
there
it may not be everybody.
there's a lot of wild plot.
Yeah, it's not just a bondage film.
Yeah. Flower and Snake, the original film production of it is, there's a still from it on the right that was made in 1974. Print media in Japan continues to move on to the height of its power. At this time, there are over 200 active SM publications in Japan at one time. Whatever weird thing you are searching for, variety is the spice of life, my friends. I think probably the reason that I included the image on the right-hand side of the woman bound to the boot, this is a photographic representation. You can see if Nora will stand up.
It's on the shirt that I'm wearing. Like,
So this image that photo is taken from, this image is from Bazaar magazine. It is a cover of Bazaar magazine. So that particular image from SM Sniper, that photo, is a direct replication of the cover of Bazaar magazine. So the idea that these two things weren't talking to each other and influencing each other is kind of ludicrous to me. All right, let's move on to what I call international expansion from 1990 to 2010. This is where we get into a place where there are people in this list and media in this list that I consumed while it was being created and that I know and that I am friends with. I will denote where I have a personal relationship with people that I call out and how that affects my opinion of them. Because there will be people in this group that I know, that I was fortunate to know and am fortunate to know.
Acknowledging bias and influence as it comes up.
Yeah. So let's talk about people and let's start in Japan. So there is a big diversification in the number of people doing bondage and the type. I'm going to go through these folks very quickly, and I'm going to try to give you an idea of like how specifically they were influential. So the first person I want to talk about is Masato Murai. Masato Murai was a performer, writer, and editor, publishing articles from 1978 to 1986. He started writing for SM Select while he was in college. He was one of the people who frequently tied for Sujiro Norio during Sujiro Norio's photography days. So he was sort of one of those beginning folks that tied with him. The second person that I want to talk about is Takeishi Nagaike. Nagaike was born in 1945. He claims that his first sexual memory was finding a copy of Kitan Club. Everybody's familiar with Woods porn. He was an early adopter. He founded the SM Club Amos in Osaka in 1977, growing it from the initial 3 members at the first meeting to over 100 members by 1982. The image on the left-hand side was from his visit to the United States in 1995 for photo and video shoots, including this photo with a very young Jenna Jameson. The other thing to know about Takeishi Nagaike was he was one of Midori's instructors and influential in her style, and his style can prevalently be seen in her book, The Erotic Art of Japanese Bondage. This is Rhonda Mai. Rhonda Mai was a bondage instructor and video director. Rhonda Mai in the West is primarily known as being somebody who published a ton of bondage instructionals. So he did 10 different bondage instructional books between 2002 and 2004, ranging from like beginner all the way to advanced sort of work. This is Akira Naka. Akira Naka is pretty ubiquitous these days. Born in 1959, still practicing rope bondage, very influential in modern rope bondage now. He was a student of Noriki Chimuo, initially learning during the Kimbaken circle that I mentioned previously. He became a student of Sujiro Norio later in life. He's toured extensively through Europe, North America. He's primarily known for working with two models. One of those is Iroha Shizuki, who's depicted on the left-hand side. Interestingly enough, and sort of this maybe apocryphal, possibly real story about Akira Naka and Iroha. Iroha was a bottom for Yukimura Haruki, who sort of Akira Naka saw as like his big brother, and asked if he could tie Iroha. And Yukimura sort of quote said like, well, yes, but I know if you tie her, I'm never going to see her again. Sort of that kind of vibe. Statement.
Also worth noting, Iroha has sort of like a share level name recognition in terms of like modern bondage models.
Yeah, everyone just calls her Iroha. It's just Iroha.
Great and very sweet.
Yeah, and very active on social media if you want to see Iroha stuff. The other person is Marika, aka Gorgone, who's depicted on the right-hand side. Met Naka in 2014, was one of the first, or the first non-Japanese model to be photographed by Sujiro Norio. Leveraged that experience and her modeling background into learning about rope, learning how to tie rope, learning and teaching about how to be tied in rope, becoming an entrepreneur for herself, and ultimately founding Shibari Study.
One quick note about Naka that you would never know by looking at these particular photos of him is that he has serious tattoos.
Yeah.
That are very impressive.
Yeah.
He basically leads a double life. Naka is not his birth name. It's a pseudonym. So yeah, like keeping in mind that this is a black market, gray market economy thing. Like he has a life, he has a family. This is a thing that his family would not condone. So like that persists.
Also, Japanese pizziola. You can go to his pizza shop in Japan if you're there. Yeah, Indano Pizzeria. If you ever want a pizza.
Like sort of to illustrate that all of these people have full and rich lives that are not just them tying.
Did you have a question? Okay. This is Kazami Ranki. He is a bondage performer and instructor who is strongly influenced by the work of Akechi Denki Takeishi Nagaike. Founded the SM Circle in Osaka in 1996, began performing in 2001, has toured Europe, the United States, Australia, has certified schools in Australia and Canada, has been here and taught in Los Angeles half dozen times. A significant amount. We've hosted Kazami a whole bunch of times. Kazami did have a consent incident with a model while teaching in Canada, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago.
And it should be noted, as we mentioned, he lives in Osaka. So he's one of the few people in this portion of things who is based in Osaka, and is the reason that we call the thing we teach you the Osaka lock, is because we learned it from someone who learned it from him. Quick contribution.
This is Akechi Kana and Akechi Kagura. Akechi Kana was born in 1972. Akechi Kana is a non-binary student of Akechi Denki who began performing and tying as a mistress in 1995. So it was Mistress Kana, which you can see depicted on the right-hand side. Founded and opened the SM Happening Bar Bug in 2001. Began performing in 2002. Is sort of the highest profile non-binary Japanese rope personality. Performs historically as Nawashi Kana, as Mistress Kana, and now taking on his instructor's name as Akechi Kana. Has toured Europe, the United States, Australia, all over the world. He and his partnership Kagura is well over 10 years now. They published a book celebrating their 10-year anniversary that Melissa and I have. It's super beautiful. I've been fortunate enough to go to their house in Japan and hang out with them for several days. Lovely people, some of my favorite people.
And Kana, to the point of that book, Kana is also a very talented and skilled photographer.
Yeah.
So does the rope and the photography.
And is great at go-kart racing. Never
Yes.
challenge him to a go-kart.
He's
Them to
obsessed with racing
Yeah.
and cars in general. And just for the record, to my understanding, he uses both male and female pronouns. So that's why we interchange them.
This is Hajime Kinoko. He is another Akechi influenced performer, instructor, and artist. He's the founder of the Tokyo-based rope group Ichinawa Kai, who sort of have a singularly systematic approach to rope instruction. He organized the first Tubaku Festival in Tokyo, which was sort of an international rope bondage festival that drew artists and performers from all over the world. He's a performer, a print artist, a conceptual artist. He's toured Europe, United States, Australia. He's been featured in multiple English language segments, including there's a 2-part profile of him in Vice. There is a portion of Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown when he's in Tokyo, where he meets up with Kinoko and his girlfriend. Has performed as recently as 1 year ago at Torture Garden in Los Angeles in October of last year, and stayed in that room right over there.
Yeah. And if you see like what's depicted on the right here with the red rope, that is almost inevitably something that Kinoko produced. He is a prolific photographer and rope artist, his specialty is kind of these 3-dimensional art installations. Also, if you see stuff where there's like sort of what's known as like a web or chaos rope, that is something that he has popularized.
All right, this is the person laying on the ground is Osada Steve. Osada Steve is a bondage performer instructor who is the sort of initial link from the Japanese community to the rest of the world. So Osada Steve was a jiu-jitsu practitioner from Europe who went to Japan and fell in love with Japan and rope bondage and just stayed there. He initially started publishing blogs in English about the Japanese rope scene under the name Dr. Device, and then since took on the name Osada Steve as a reference to Osada Akechi. He traveled from Japan to Germany to sort of teach and kind of certify people. He began as a fashion and fetish photographer in Tokyo in 1990. The Dr. Device blog started in 1997. He founded a space called Studio 6 in 2000. He started hosting Osada Akechi as a performer and then performing with him, and then sort of took over his name. He's a student of Akechi Dinki, Akechi Kana, and Yukimura Haruki. He's a founder of Osada Ryu, which is a systematized method of learning and teaching that's certified instructors all over Europe, Australia. There are some in the United States as well. I wanted to call out in specific the person on the right-hand side, which is a model called Aiko, or Tiger Aiko, who we had a long-term partnership with. She is a professional aerialist, burlesque performer, contortionist, circus performer. We had the privilege of hosting her in Los Angeles to teach modeling for bondage. Their relationship was so long that he printed an entire book just called Tiger that was about like their tying relationship. Steve has had multiple consent violations while teaching over the past 5 to 7 years. Let's talk about some European folks, and then we'll talk about some North American folks. When going to Europe, I want to talk about somebody that I personally know really well, which is Wicked Dave and Clover. They are performers, instructors, bloggers, photographers that are based in the UK. Wicked Dave, for tying, has trained with Osada Steve, Hajime Kinoko, Kazami Ranki, Yukimura Haruki, Akira Naka, and Sujiro Inorio. They began doing publicly photographing in and around 2009. They've toured Europe, the United States, Japan, Australia. Dave has tied rope for multiple high-profile films, videos, and possibly most notably, a portrait of Lady Gaga that was hung in the Louvre. Very sort of not only someone who has absorbed rope bondage styles from tons of influential living instructors, but someone who has very much their own approach and style, in the way of saying like people creating unique things. There are things that I think that Dave has contributed that stand outside just those things that he's learned from other people. Clover has certainly contributed a lot to the understanding of what it means to be someone in bondage. So Clover published a book called Clover's Guide for, I think it's it Clover's Guide for Better Bondage? I can't remember the exact name of it. It's been translated into 8+ languages.
Clover's rope bottoming guide?
Yeah. But really sort of both of them amazing resources. This is Zamil. Zamil is a performer instructor based in Berlin. He started doing SM shows in 2003. He traveled to Japan to learn from Osada Steve in 2004. He was the editor-in-chief of Bondage Magazine in Germany. He's primarily known as having a background in sort of physical movement and dance that is exhibited by a tying style that is like highly frenetic, very acrobatic, very dance-oriented. This is Pedro Reyes, excuse me, or as most people would know him, Pedro. Pedro is a performer and instructor based in Lisbon. Is a student of Akechi, Osada Steve, Akechi Kana, Hajime Kinoko, Akira Naka, Yukimura Haruki. Produced and directed a film called Juwoya, which documents the rope styles of Naka, Yukimura, Akechi, Arado Hiroshi that I mentioned earlier, and Kinoko. The film was released in 2011. I have a copy of it if you're interested in it. Melissa and I were very close with Pedro. Melissa and I are no longer very close with Pedro. Pedro sexually assaulted and raped a model in 2018. And unfortunately still does rope bondage these days. It's not great. This is Hedwig. Hedwig is, for the three of us, someone we get emotional about.
Yeah.
Because I love Hedwig a lot. Hedwig is a queer rope performer and instructor who's based in Malmo, Sweden. Wrote their undergraduate thesis on Jabari in 2011. Founder of Hitch and Bitches International, which is an organization that was focused on non-male bodied people learning how to tie. Say more.
Hedwig and I were teaching partners for a number of years. We wrote and taught what is, to my knowledge, the first class that was offered at a large convention about body image and kink and how your body impacts the ways that you practice kink. They are retired. They're semi-active on social media. Please don't bug them. Hedwig is someone that we get emotional about in part because the landscape of rope education as it exists today could not exist without what Hedwig did in terms of normalizing queer sexuality, queer bodies, large bodies, and education outside of dominant norms and paradigms. They're an incredible human, and I think it is a real loss for all of us that the costs of developing that curriculum and teaching it were too high for them to continue it sustainably. We are worse for having burned this person out.
Yeah, they were incredibly ahead of their time, and we are indebted to them for doing that work and putting that out into the world for us to benefit from. So I am forever indebted to that person. It should also be said that with Ordinals as their teaching partner, we would not have met Ordinals were it not for being at an intensive that Hedwig and Ordinals were teaching.
So meet cute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna stop being a big crybaby.
No, you aren't.
And I'm going to talk about somebody that I equally love, but I am less close with, which is Midori. Midori is a queer performer, writer, speaker, artist, instructor based in San Francisco. Born in Kyoto, grew up in Tokyo, moved to the United States as a teen, was gracious enough to consult with me after having watched me do this presentation to talk to me about things that I could add and amend. Super gracious with her time.
Helping fill in some
Yeah.
of the gaps that Andrew was unaware of.
Because information is inaccessible for reasons we've dictated before. Began learning rope bondage from Takeishi Nagaike in the 80s. Founded Midori's Rope Dojo in 2001, offering an English language organized approach to learning rope bondage.
And it should be noted, is a little litigious, so if you get in your mind that you want to call something a rope dojo, don't do it.
Yeah. Midori owns Rope Dojo. Do not infringe, motherfuckers. You will get a cease and desist like
Save
that.
yourself some time and just pick a different name.
This is Lee Harrington.
They don't.
No,
They
that's
don't.
not.
They are called LA Rope.
They are
for a
called,
very
yeah.
good reason.
They are called LA Rope for a reason.
I heard someone yesterday refer to it them as Ellie Road.
Yeah.
It is not officially their name anymore.
Okay.
And that's why.
This is Lee Harrington. Lee Harrington is a queer trans performer, a writer, a speaker, an artist, an instructor, and a leather person. Began as a sexuality educator and a bondage model. Has taught over 700 classes to date, published 6 nonfiction works on sexuality and SM, including 2 books on Shibari. Still is active in tours. This is Lokai Stein. Lokai Stein is a performer, director, photographer, and instructor based out of Baltimore, Maryland. Producer and a director on hogtie.com and founder of Rope Bite International, which was sort of a group that was oriented around organizing people who tied rope bondage in different cities for either rope practice or munches. That was founded in 2009.
And that image on the right is probably his most iconic and well-known and least attributed photo. It's definitely one of the first ones I ever saw, and only years later did I find out that that was something that Lokai produced.
Yeah.
So, going back to the importance of attribution.
This is Chanta Rose. Chanta Rose was a performer, director, producer, photographer, instructor, and author based out of San Francisco. Was born in Australia, moved to London before landing in San Francisco. Was the author of Bondage for Sex in 2006, and the producer and director of the website Chanta's Bitches. Finally, the person tying and on the right of the right-hand image is Madame Butterfly, who's a performer, instructor, rope maker, who's based out of San Francisco. Was hand making and selling ropes in 2007 when sort of access to ropes and getting ropes purchased was a difficult thing to manage. Let's talk about all of the media and events. I don't know why the screen is doing, there we go. So many media and events. So we're gonna start to go through some of the people in the media that they created and then events that were associated with those. So let's start out with film. These are images of Rhonda Mai's complete Kinbaku manual that came out in 2002. So I mentioned Rhonda Mai was primarily known for publishing a whole bunch of instructionals. This is one of the DVD instructionals. Kind of a lot of the popularity that he gained was in and around the access to cheap cost of producing videos and then distributing instructionals. This is the Baku Yukai Volume 1 from 1996. This was one of the last videos that featured Akechi Dinky tying before he passed away. It also includes the tying of someone named Miro Takumi, who was one of Akechi's students who was also very recently passed away within the last year. If you have an interest in this, I have this entire series. I'm happy to share it with people. This is from Yukimura's Petite Rope Course in 2002. This was a beginner instructional that Yukimura published that was a lot about like just tying for sexy times. You'll notice in this particular image, he's tying with a necktie. So it's a lot of like non-rope tying, a lot of understanding your partner for like non-rope aficionados that want to do bondage. This is a movie called I Am an SM Writer. You can still find this now. It was released in 2000. It's based on a novel by Oniroku Dan and loosely based on the life of Minamura Ku. Really good movie if you have a chance, very well made. At the same time, there was also a movie that was released called Bakushi in 2007. It's a documentary that highlights the work of Arisu Go, Nareki Chimuo, Sujiro Norio, and Hiromi Satomi. There were a whole lot of English language things published in this time. Some of them in some of the first books that I owned when I was getting into bondage in any sort of serious way included Jay Weissman's Erotic Bondage Handbook. Certainly included The Seductive Art of Japanese Bondage with Midori, with a great photo of Dita Von Teese on the cover. Come on, y'all. These are the two books that are Mind and Technique from the Arisu Go tour, the first published in the English language from a Japanese instructor. Who doesn't own a copy of The Two Naughty Boys showing you the ropes, either one or two? I think as you get into rope bondage, they just issue it to you for free. So many double coin nights. So many double coin nights. The last is The Beauty of Kinbaku, which was published by Master K, who's a Los Angeles-based rope instructor. It was the first, and a certified Yukimura instructor, along with the person who runs LA Rope Dojo, or LA Rope, excuse me. Zetsu. So Beauty of Kinbaku is the first English language sort of history of general history of rope bondage.
It does kind of tie some direct line
Yeah,
between
much like
Hojo Jutsu
much like my declamation that I come at this kind of conversation with a specific political outlook and a specific perspective. Keep in mind when you read this history, the person who published it comes at it from a specific perspective, whether or not they enumerate that perspective.
But it should be noted about that particular book is that the people that Andrew and I primarily learned from had a lot of influence into that and are sometimes in certain versions of that book are actually depicted in the photos. They are uncredited.
And yet are not credited, either as photographers or models.
And so that is one of the major criticisms I have of that particular book.
Yeah. This was an era in which audio podcasts became a thing. So one of the things that I would point you to, if you can find the archives, is Great Answers Ropecast. Great Answers Ropecast, being a great document of this era of rope bondage, is primarily responsible for Madison, Wisconsin being the rope bondage capital of the world. Because Gray would open every single podcast with, coming to you live from the rope bondage capital of the world, Madison, Wisconsin. And every time that Google records that thing, it becomes more true. So if you open up your phone right now and Google rope bondage capital of the world, it will tell you it's Madison, Wisconsin.
If you say something enough times, it becomes true.
Yep.
On the internet.
This was also the era of specific bondage-related events happening. Most explicitly Thunder in the Mountains, which was founded in 1997 and included presenters like Midori, people like Scott Smith, people like Max BLC, people we don't talk about anymore because they have severe consent issues.
So many consent issues.
But mostly the people that are not named Midori that I just listed. The second is ShibariCon. ShibariCon was founded in 2003. Presenters there included people like Midori, Lokai, Great Answer, Mark and Alani Deviate from Australia, Wikidave and Clover, Saki Kamishu, Barkus and Hishikaro, Kazami Ranki, Zamil, Tifrith, Gorgone, and again, people with problematic consent issues like Mark Yu and local Los Angeles Michael Saul. This is a place where I first met a very young and fresh-faced Ordinals. It was the first rope convention that I ever went to. Yeah, I met you there.
No.
Yeah, very briefly. We didn't talk.
Was it the head bondage class?
Yes, it was the Hedwig's Head Bondage Head Fuck
Yeah,
class.
Hedwig and I taught a head bondage class there.
And I was in it.
Yeah.
Um,
I did not remember, clearly.
We have 5 minutes left, and we're probably going to go over because I have so much to cover. I'm going to try to speed through this with as few additions as possible. I apologize. The last section is called Bondage Worldwide. This, to me, is the diversification of bondage across anyone who might be interested in it, going from 2010 until now. I am not going to discuss people that are currently influential in rope bondage because they are currently influential and you should be able to find them. If you can't and you're looking for my opinion on who these people are, ask me, I'm happy to tell you because I have opinions.
Office hours tomorrow from 6
Yep.
to 8 on Discord.
Let's talk about in Japan. In Japan, there are 4 people I want to talk about. The first is Saki Kamishu. Saki Kamishu is a performer, instructor, and previous owner of the SM salon Piss in Osaka. You gotta love an SM salon called Piss. began performing in 2005, is the lead singer and guitarist for the band Cholera, where she often ties while playing guitar and singing songs.
Saki fucks.
Saki probably is one of the fastest people at tying I have. Can put on a 3-rope gote in under 2 minutes. It is insane. She's toured Europe, the United States, and Australia, including Mexico, which I think is a neglected portion of North America when people tour. This is Otanawa Tsubasa. Again, emotional. If I have a Japanese brother in rope bondage, it is Otanawa. They are students of Hajime Kinoko, members and founding members of Ichinawa Kai. Otanawa is a comedian and a professional wrestler who at 55 years old still professionally wrestles in Japan. They are the owners of the SM Bar Titty Twister with his partner who is pictured here, Tsubasa. He has a background in performing arts, including comedy, acting, and professional wrestling, including kabuki. Performs a hilarious comedy SM show with Kinoko where they just like tie each other and hurt each other and laugh about hurting each other. It's goddamn amazing and one of my favorite things.
And Tsubasa also ties.
Yeah, Tsubasa also ties and is a wicked good rope artist. We were fortunate enough when we visited Japan that they essentially let us live with them for like 3 weeks. Yeah, they're amazing. This is Hirai Kasumi. Kasumi is a performer and a teacher who is influenced specifically by Akechi Denki, Hajime Kinoko, Akechi Kana, and Akira Naka. Former student of Akira Naka's, began doing self-tying in the 1980s, started teaching and working as a professional mistress in 1997. Very recently returned to FetLife, so you can find them there. The final person I want to talk about is Yagami Ren. Yeah, somebody made a face, and then yeah, of course I saw the shoot. Yagami Ren is heavily influenced by the styles of Akechi Denki and Akechi Kana. A lot of his rope work is also influenced by his background, sort of similar to Asada Steve as a nearly Olympic level jiu-jitsu practitioner. So a lot of the like rotational arm locks that we teach you, the first place we ever heard of them was when Yagami Ren was touring. In this particular picture, and the first person who sort of brought him to light for Western audiences was Marika, aka Gorgon. So this is a picture of the two of them tying together. Yes. Yes. Oh, I did not know that. Oh, I did not know that.
I think their name is Sin.
Okay. I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Like, I think S-I-N.
S-I-N? Okay.
Or S-Y-N.
Uh,
Sorry.
Important to get because they're the next person that I'm talking about. As they were a former professional model, then a professional bondage model, then an instructor for bondage modeling, then an instructor for rope. Worked with both Akira Naka and Yagami Ren, founder and I believe CEO of Shibari Study. The person doing the tying in this instance, or in this image, is Felix Ruckert, performance and bondage artist that combines theatrical movement with rope bondage, founder of Schwelle 7, which was a Berlin-based, I believe, rope and kink studio, and probably, as importantly, the founder of Eurix, the European Rope Innovation Exchange. This is Ricardo Wild Ties and Red Sabbath. Ricardo is a performer, instructor, photographer based in Italy. Initially self-taught, became a student of Akira Naka in 2015, has repetitively taught Naka style, but is now teaching under his own style. Regular collaborator with Wicked Dave and Barkus, toured Europe, the United States, Japan, has multiple consent issues and incidences. The two people depicted, the person tying is Fred Hatt, the person being tied is Anna Bones. Fred Hatt and Anna Bones are performers, instructors, and photographers based out of London. They've consulted and tied on multiple photographic, video, and television projects, toured Europe and the United States, and they most prominently founded Anatomy Studios based in London, which is the largest rope bondage studio in that city. The last person depicted tying here is Nicholas Uroy. Nicholas Uroy is a performer and instructor based in Brussels. incorporates aspects of bondage, massage, aikido, and dance into what he refers to as Yoroi Ryu. Let's talk about some homegrown North American talents, and these are some of my, again, favorite people.
Homegrown?
Well, not homegrown. George Barkas was originally from Vienna, Austria, but is now based in Vancouver. Was a student of Vincennes and the Osada Ryu studio that Vincennes started in Vienna, co-founder of the Osada Ryu Dojo. Learned from Osada Steve, was certified by Osada Steve. Learned from Yukimura Haruki, was certified by Yukimura Haruki. Learned from Akechi Kana. They've toured Europe, North America, Japan. Their initial partnership was with a model on the left named Hishikaro, but is currently partnered with and married to the model on the right, Addie Tall. They founded the Space 2 in Vancouver.
And he has his own rope style.
Next person I want to talk about is Fuoko. Fuoko is a performer, model, instructor, previously based in Vermont?
In Vermont, correct?
Yeah. Applied her background in circus performing arts and biomechanics to both tying and being in rope. A person who wrote a book on how to be in a TK, and is somebody that I still consult to this day and talk to. This is probably, for my dollar, the most innovative person in rope bondage that you have likely never heard of. This is Tifrith. Tifrith is a performer, instructor, again, emotional.
Yeah.
Model based in Toronto, who began tying in 2011. Has applied her background in athletics to instruction and being tied, self-tying and tying others. Is the founder of String Theory Studios in Toronto, also the owner of Birdhouse in Toronto. Tifrith is the innovation of the stuff that Tifrith has brought to rope bondage that has either not been accredited to them or is accredited to other people is one of the things I'm most angry about in rope bondage.
If you are familiar with the 10-sheet tie, that is a rebranding of an upper body harness that Tifrith created.
Called Fucky Arms.
And Tifrith does have a lot of performances on YouTube. They're freaking
Yeah.
amazing.
Tifrith's performances are insane. Tifrith's ideas about rope bondage are insane. Every time I now have every couple of months, Tifrith and I exchange ideas. It is some of the most happy phone calls I have. I am giddy like a child.
I know that we're rushing. Tifrith is a sex worker that continues throughout the history and current reality of rope bondage. Tifrith cannot enter the U.S. because of their profession. Again, sex work is real work. Borders are fake. We are all worse for that decision.
Yeah.
They are banned from the United States for another 3 years.
Yeah,
So-
Europe has benefited from Tifrith being able to travel there, and America has lost because of it. Speaking of people who are insanely innovative and who I think people don't know enough about, this is Lizard. Lizard is a queer performer and instructor who sometimes is retired and occasionally is not. Uses their application of medical level physiology knowledge into tying others and the biomechanics of rope. Uses the ways that bodies can move as a way to define what they tie, as opposed to tying things based on the way that bodies move. I can't overstate their influence. This is Moko and Bimo. Moko and Bimo were performers, instructors, and rope makers based in Philadelphia. They are no longer a couple. The reason that I sort of want to bring Moko specifically and Bimo, they were innovators in marketing of rope bondage. So you've likely heard of Moko Jute, Moko's brand of rope. That exists primarily through the marketing conceit of getting people to, I will give you rope, but whenever you take a photo using my rope, you need to call out that you used my rope. This literally started the trend, and this blows my goddamn mind, of people not just showing a picture of somebody tied up, but attributing, this person is the model, this person is the photographer, and this is also the rope that I got for free, so I need to say this. Literally, the idea of crediting all of those people when you took a photo mostly exists because of Moko Jute. And that to me is crazy.
Moko Jute invented influencer marketing before that was a thing.
Yeah.
Broadly.
All right, so let's burn through the last of this, the media both offline and online. So we're going to talk about some books really quickly. Offline, expanding concerns to address the needs of people not just in rope, but people who didn't fit sort of heteronormative contexts around rope, who wanted to tie themselves, who had different approaches to philosophy about rope in general. I mentioned this earlier, but this is Clover's Guide for Rope Bondage and Bondage Models. This is Evie Vane's Better Bondage for Every Body. Call out, Melissa and I are in that book. We were asked to consult on that book. This is not a sales pitch. We do not get any money from it. It is still a great book. It is a collection of rope knowledge that was correlated by Evie, but that shares rope bondage knowledge from people from all over the world.
Yeah, basically she's the editor, and
Yeah.
it's like chapters by a bunch of different people, including Ms. Doctor and Uoko, who have expertise in the chapter material that they're
Yeah. This is Tying and Flying, Shay Tiziano's book on self-bondage.
And Shay is an ER RN, so has a specific medical background as well.
Based out of San Francisco, still performs, easily findable. This is Barkas's Archaeology of Personalities. It is a linguistic approach to erotic rope bondage, or a deep philosophical treatise about what and why and how of the rope bondage.
It's a tough read.
It is a dense read. Also in this time, you started to get events that were specifically rope bondage forward, including things like Bondage Expo Dallas and Ropecraft.
Ropecraft's still ongoing. Ben has, I believe, retired.
Yep. And then finally, online availability of things. One that still exists and one that doesn't. Remember the original Shibari Study branding, y'all? Shibari Study branding, the original kind. This is Shibari Study. Shibari Study still exists today, founded by the previously mentioned Sin, aka Marika, aka Gorgon. Has done a lot for democratizing the availability of rope instruction and publicizing a variety of types of rope instructors, the importance of education of being in rope, all of those things. The second.
Really benefited from the fact that they were online before the pandemic lockdown. So they were set up well for that.
The second one is the now defunct Ropeflix. Ropeflix was built in the model of Netflix and leveraged the licensing of Japanese specific digital media published for the streaming market. Apparently that wasn't as popular as might have been thought because it is now defunct. But I have a whole bunch of stuff downloaded from them.
When was Ropeflix?
Pre-pandemic, for about 2 years. It was run actually by Zetsu, the person who runs LA Rope in LA. With that said, we are done. Do you have any questions? We are 8 minutes over. I'm going to turn off the stream because I got to pee so bad.
I got it. I can do this.
So bad I got to pee.